Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Dauphinais. And today we're joined by Dr. Janice Chik Breidenbach, professor of philosophy at Ave Maria University. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Well, I really appreciate your being here, and I'm so excited today to get to talk about just a fascinating topic. You've developed a course and have taught a course on the philosophy of motherhood.
That's right.
And I think that's just something that is so important for people to think about and try to come to understand. I know so many people have questions, but maybe just to kind of start with like an easy objection, right? But why are we studying motherhood? I mean, isn't motherhood so obvious that it doesn't require a university level course?
Sure. I think from one perspective, a lot of things are so obvious that they don't require university level courses. Like I would say metaphysics, philosophy of being, right? Like we all are. And so why do we need to study that? Or even ethics, right? We all are, we seem to have an intuitive grasp of what the good life is. And so why do we need to study it? And I think, what Aristotle says at the beginning of the Metaphysics is really apropos here. I mean, he says basically that what distinguishes us from animals is that we not only experience the world, but we reflect on our experiences. Mm-hmm. And these experiences come to have a deeper meaning for us. We want to know the first causes of things. Mm-hmm. And we should not rest content with just, sort of saying, yes, that's a common experience. And as motherhood is a very pervasive for the majority of women in the world, motherhood is this very pervasive and familiar experience. So, I myself too, didn't think motherhood would be interesting, but when I became a mother, I really, realized like I was proven wrong.
Wow!
By that.
Wow, that's really a great that's a great insight there, and reminds me. I think C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles says something that often what's the most obvious is the most easily overlooked. Mm-hmm. And there I think he's talking about kind of when you're out on a beautiful day, outside on a beautiful day, you're looking at everything, you forget that the sun is illuminating everything that you're seeing. And he also says in a way, right, when we're seeing the world being caused by God as creator, we often forget the most obvious thing, namely God.
Right.
Right. And we can get lost. And so I wonder if in some ways, motherhood is also kind of such a pervasive experience that we often forget it. I mean, and in some ways, right, maybe we have this kind of idea of the self-made individual, and that kind of the role of motherhood and all of these different things are kind of forgotten. So maybe what are some ways in which you've seen or kind of discovered, right, this most obvious reality in a way forgotten or overlooked?
Yeah, I actually think culturally in our modern, society that motherhood is not just overlooked, it's really scorned. And,
wow.
I'm just speaking from a kind of, a kind of general, feminist kind of view, right? That motherhood is really in opposition to being a woman and to being fully actualized as a person. Mm-hmm. And so no, I think the problem is a very serious one. It does demand greater philosophical reflection and theological reflection for us to really understand. And, in a very, I think, reasonable way, we can see that nothing is maybe more important than parenthood, right? Because this is where we begin. Theology is a very high science, but the child only knows his own parents. Mm-hmm. And so there's a kind of beginning of knowledge right there that should make us pause and say, okay, this is a very significant sort of relationship, both mother and father, but I would say the mother in a kind of primary way. So in some sense, we can't neglect it. And, we can become mothers and fathers in the biological sense, but then we really have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to actually be a mother and a father? Mm-hmm. I think everywhere we are neglecting it. Is that your question? Like sort of, growing up as
the way you're describing it too, is that it's not just maybe a forgotten, but perhaps a scorned reality. Yeah. Do you have any sense for why is it that people have come to see motherhood as somehow, right, a threat?
Yeah.
I mean, we almost, it's like a threat to the woman's fulfillment.
Yeah, no, I think people assume that there's a kind of zero-sum proposition here, right? Mm-hmm. That when you become a mother, you become less. right? And
Wow, yeah.
and I think I think young women are sort of formed in this way, right? I was certainly, like, when I went through college, I went to Princeton, of course, and, like, of course you get people like saying, well, the worst possible thing that you could do is, like, graduate from college and then, like, get married and become a mom, like, right after.
Wow,
And there's a real cultural pressure not to do that. I mean, you certainly would never think of doing that while you're still in college, right? So yeah, I'm not sure. I think, like, sort of from a material perspective, even this is a wrong view, right? Because, like, there's something about motherhood that, from an Aristotelian point of view, is you're actualizing the powers that you've got. I mean, I was very struck by, I had my, our son at 35, and I was struck by how incredible, right? Sort of it was to have these powers in my body that, like, I never knew existed, and that were, like, being actualized through the act of becoming a mother. And it really felt very empowering. And, I mean, it's good you feel that way even at 9 months pregnant, right? Because, like, you both feel like a beast of burden as well as, like, really empowered, actually. And I think that is the reality of it. I remember telling my husband, like, I felt like I had superpowers that were, like, emerging in me, right? Like, you think about, like, the magic, like, just the amazing, right? The womb itself can expand, like, 1,000 times its size, right? The woman's body can grow a whole new organ, right? The placenta, just the ability to sustain life, the ability to produce milk, right? It's like really amazing. I don't know, like, what, how men, like, get around this, but I told Michael, like, I felt like it was, like, superpowers that I never knew I had. And he said, well, I think men have superpowers too, but, like, we'll leave that aside, but I think even from a biological perspective, it's very empowering, and we should see it that way. And it's not really a zero-sum proposition.
So maybe part of one of the one of the contemporary ideas is there's this, right, either or, there's a collision course between a career and motherhood.
Right.
And almost it's like that's kind of built into people's DNA today.
Right.
How do you see that maybe being overcome?
That's the hard question. And I think that, the modernity proposes one extreme solution, which is, right, you don't, right? Maybe you have a child or two, right? Two would be the maximum. But you don't actually actively mother your children. But there is also another extreme to that, which is, you can't work, right? You can't make it work, but you can't have it all. And so you have to, women really should be stay-at-home mothers and not do anything else, right? And I think that this is the tricky question. It's a question that Anne Marie Slaughter, addresses at length. And I actually think Anne Marie Slaughter was my dean at Princeton in the Woodrow Wilson School. And, I respected her in the way that, like, a professional woman, I think, is very she's very respectable professionally. But she came out with this Atlantic article that was kind of shocking, when it came out. And it's titled "Why Women Still Can't Have It All." And in the article, it's basically kind of a confession, right? That she's writing. She says, like, she was hired by Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, and she would commute from Princeton every week, and so she was living in D.C. And she just thought, okay, my sons are grown up, like, they don't need me, right? But the police started getting called, for, like, various things. I mean, it was, like, pretty serious, and she regretted it. She writes that, I didn't want to admit this, but my sons needed me. So I think that, even a woman like her, right, who's, like, I would say, like, very different from the milieu that Ave Maria offers, right? I think we all recognize that, there must be some way of synthesizing or integrating the work of being a mother with the professional vocation that we have. I think that there must be a way to do this. I mean, for my part, I'm very lucky in that my work is very flexible. I go to the university a few times a week to teach and to be on campus for meetings and to see students. But most of my work can be done from home. And especially when our son was a newborn, I found it possible to get lots of writing done, when all he did was, eat and sleep and, do like basic animal things. So I think that we do need to recognize that the workplace sometimes is structured in such a way that it excludes the possibility of motherhood. And we should be, I think we should reconsider that. Also with the consideration that, yes, children sometimes make it impossible to have an efficient meeting, right? But there must be a way around that. And so I think, Slaughter's proposal, and she doesn't get that much into specific, she mentioned some things, but, the proposal is like, we need to rethink the workplace. And I know like some people don't like that option, but I mean, if women are going to work and, this is our economic situation that most people have to work. It's just not possible for, I think, for most people for only one partner one spouse to work. We do need to like sort of reconsider that and find a way for motherhood to be, for us to recognize it, right, as the identity of a woman who is also a professional. So that's just my view. I think that there can be a way to do that, but
well, it's also interesting that if you think about people, in part, it seems that one of the stories that our culture wants to tell us, and that you said you learned as a student at Princeton, is the idea that professional work will satisfy your deepest longings and your search for meaning and purpose. And it seems to me that one thing that everyone discovers and that everyone knows is that professional work will never satisfy your deepest longings. And so we have kind of this kind of obvious contradiction in a way that's at the heart of much of our educational system.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that work, I think, can become a tremendous part of your meaning and purpose, where you recognize one of the things you have to contribute to the world is a professional vocation, an actual skill, right? A job, something that you can do well that allows you to serve others and benefit some, all these things are wonderful, but it's not meant to kind of bear all the weight. And I think at times we need maybe something like motherhood and fatherhood. It seems to me, I think this is true for fathers to really find meaning. One of the ways fathers, I think, intrinsically find meaning in work is providing for family.
I think it's seamless in that sense, right? I mean, our work, if work is just a form of self-aggrandizement, right? I mean, it's just like I just feel good, right, when I do my work well. Then that's where it really falls short, right? But like I think what you're saying is, if work is viewed as a form of service, right, that it's part of my relationship, right, to others, and a kind of appreciation for, right, so like someone who doesn't have children, for instance, maybe they're not married, right, can also find satisfaction by placing work in a secondary, right, as a means to the end of, right, human relationships. And so then, like, the fact that we're mothers and fathers reveals to us, right, like what the real point was all along, right?
It is
like
for the sense that aspect of relationship. And so then work isn't, so to speak, like something, it's not like one part of our life that's cut off and abstracted from the rest of our life.
That's right.
But it brings, our relationships bring meaning to our work, and our work brings meanings to our relationships.
Exactly. Including our families, I think.
And in many, I think that maybe the normal mode in which people discover this is, or at least maybe the most common mode where I think people discover it most powerfully is probably through something like fatherhood and motherhood, when if they happen to have children, recognize that here's another person who's totally dependent upon them.
Right.
And that can often awaken a sense of a sense of responsibility that otherwise is latent.
It completely changes the way you look at the world.
How have you
and the
seen
way you
that?
look at yourself.
And you spoke a little bit about, that you had a child several years ago. How have you discovered that?
Well, I think that, the sense in which a child is, as you're saying, so wholly dependent on you as, a parent, really places you, reinforces your understanding of your place in the cosmos, right?
Wow.
I mean, I see something very theological in it, the sense in which, right, we come into the world blind and naked and right and so vulnerable. I was also struck by the fact that babies do tend to fast for the most part. Like they don't eat very much, you know, they don't know how, right? They don't even know how to eat, right? In the first like day or two of life. And so inevitably they lose weight and, you know, the vulnerability and a sense of the mother's worry increases, right? Sort of with all of that. And yet the mother then really, right, sees her body, right, sort of as completely encompassing the life of the child, like in such a way that it's even beyond her own sort of volition, right? It's beyond her own reasoning and deliberation. It's something that nature offers, right? The fact that, I mean, I think like the medievals thought that the flow of milk, right, when a baby was born was miraculous. I thought it was like incredible. And they drew all sorts of like theological parallels, right, to the nourishment that the church offers us, the nourishment that Christ, right, with his wounds, right, sort of offers us, and Mary, right, sort of with her sustenance. So I think it just completely changes the way that you see yourself and your own, right, just through the very vulnerability of this little baby. And then you remember like God made himself like this. It's just incredible, right? Like it just really cements like sort of our dependence.
I think there's an interesting image there. In a way, the mother and the father to a certain extent, but especially the mother, discovers the absolute vulnerability of the child. Right? Even, I remember, I think the first time I was around an infant, you know, the fact that they don't smile for 2 months or something, it's like these weird things. They're so vulnerable. But in a certain sense, we discover both our ability to care for another one, but also our vulnerability.
That's right,
That we can't get out of the vulnerability cycle.
Right.
You know, that we want to, if we love a child who is so vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
I mean, did you find that was a way of almost discovering our own vulnerability?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
As well?
But yeah, I think you're also speaking to the fact that, for instance, the baby doesn't smile or laugh. I mean, Paul Thomas, I don't think laughed. He didn't smile at me until I think he was like 4 months old or something. So I had to wait for it, you know? And yeah, I think what you're speaking to is we feel the vulnerability of also loving, right, another who does not love us back, right? Like the baby does not, I mean, I know like, I mean, people maybe have these, you know, it's just not true. Like the baby doesn't love you back. Like they don't, like they're completely, you know, it's just need love all the way, right? I mean, and, you know, and yet, right, I think nature helps with this, right? Like nature offers like the mother all sorts of like chemical and hormonal, right, sort of incentives to take care of the child, but and emotionally, right? But that has to be practiced too, and and you learn, right, to love another creature who maybe doesn't deserve it. Right. Instead, like, you know, flings like poop on you and like, you know, gets you really like it's just messy. You know, you're sleep deprived. Right.
So somehow in the midst of all that, what I hear you suggesting is this idea is that we discover one of our greatest callings and purposes. Right. We have this latent capacity to not only to pass on life and nourish life and educate life. Right. But it's almost like we don't know it's there. Until we...
Right. It's in our bodies. Like there's something very late, like there's something biological about it. I think for a father, it feels a little different, right? And in some sense, I feel like I think the mother has to mediate, right? And show the father. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to speak for all fathers here, but in some sense, for instance, the mother knows first, like when the child begins to move, right?
Sure,
And then the natural thing is like she gets her husband to come and like feel that, right? So there's some sense in which the mother is a kind of intercessor for the child, that kind of mediating relationship. And all the more, right? You think like if mothers are not interested in actually mothering, then why do we expect fathers to be around, right? Why do we expect fathers to father?
You know, there's an interesting line from, I don't remember where it is in the Old Testament, but I think it might be Isaiah, but it's that idea that, you know, should a mother forget her child, you know, God will still remember us. And
that's supposed to be an argument from absurdity, right? It's like, that is not possible. It is not possible that a mother should forget her own child.
Absolutely. And it seems like, in a certain sense, in our culture, we have we have mothers forgetting their children insofar as they forget to be mothers at all. Like that's kind of like where I feel like your work about trying to help people remember, you know, motherhood, as seeing that. So we're going to take a break now, but when we get back, I'd love to ask a few more questions about how do we learn from motherhood when things go wrong? So we'll talk a little bit about that after the break.
Okay, great.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. If you'd like to support our mission, we invite you to prayerfully consider joining our Annunciation Circle, a monthly giving program aimed at supporting our staff, faculty, and Catholic faith formation. You can visit us at avemaria.edu to learn more. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
Well, Janice, I'd love to hear a little bit about, what happens when I think people have a desire maybe to become a mother. Perhaps they're married and they can't have children, or perhaps they want to get married and they can't find a suitable spouse. How does reflections on motherhood, right, help people who are in such situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. Get a dog. No, I'm just kidding. That's what most people do, right?
That's right. Yes,
no,
yes,
I think, but I think actually that what we see, which is not new, right? It's just kind of we've all seen this among the aristocracy, right? Who are childless, like they have pets. We're seeing it more among the middle class now, right? That everyone has a pet, like who doesn't have a child, and there is something there, right? Like I think we do have to recognize that. A person who does this, right, has maternal instincts. Among the millennial generation, like people will joke about how like their plant babies, are sufficient for them, right? It's like I have enough, right? You either have a plant baby or you have a fur baby. Wow. And as someone who formerly thought motherhood would be, more burdensome than it was. To be honest with you, I was just raised by this culture, that said like, your career, professional life, and it's more fun, right? Life is more fun without children. These maternal, instincts like just won't go away, right? And you can't satisfy them, right, with plant babies and fur babies, right? And I don't, you can't really explain that to someone, until they've actually become a mother to some extent biologically. So there is a kind of problem here, right? There's a philosopher, L.A. Paul, who writes about, she argues that there's certain experiences that we really can't know about until we actually experience them, right? And she actually I think this has interesting implications for women who have abortions because they think that having a child is not going to be worth it, or it's not going to be it's not going to be a good experience. And Paul's argument seems to have the implication that you don't know that. You can't possibly know that, right? So there is something about biological motherhood that, just as you can't really theorize it until, you can't understand it until you've experienced it. But at the same time, I do think that there is a kind of account of motherhood, the biological account, that can be analogized to, like we can see an analogy for the way in which biological motherhood, right, this natural sense of motherhood, this giving of the very body of the mother, right? There's a sense in which like the mother's body is a person's first home, right? It is the entire cosmos like contained within just this, right? And like there's everything in her body like has the sustenance that a child needs. There is this, breastfeeding is like, it's painful for a lot of women, but it's also incredible, right? That like you can just like, if it works out for you, you can just take your child anywhere, right? And like the child will be just fine, right? They don't need, you may have to sort of scrounge around for food, right? But that's another story. So I think in some sense, like the analogy for that to a kind of, what theologians might call spiritual motherhood, the sense in which Mary actually encompasses both the spiritual motherhood as well as the natural motherhood, right? There's something like kind of incredible about the way in which she shows us that the natural is not enough. And, our understanding of the natural, however, offers us an understanding of how we can love others, right? By giving of ourselves in this way, too.
And maybe the way you describe it, it seems like we all do actually maybe experience motherhood in a way. The normal, obviously there are a few extreme situations, but most of us have had mothers.
Yes.
And so maybe our first experience of motherhood is on the receiving end.
Right.
And learning to become aware of and appreciative of the role of our own mothers, so that like we're already in a world in which motherhood is a reality.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Even if we aren't, even if, a young woman or a woman is not able to be a mother. And even just, my own growing up, I remember having two older sisters, and, I don't know that they were secondary mothers, but they were in a certain sense maternal in their love they were, I think, I always kind of grew up thinking like they were my biggest fans, so to speak. And, I feel like, so there is a kind of sense in which I think many family members kind of express that kind of maternal sense of love and care and nurturing and support. And, that kind of, and it seems that's a way that maybe, any woman can bring that, bring that disposition to a variety of relationships, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Julian of Norwich, like the anchoress, right?
Yes,
I think
she's a 14th century
that's right,
theologian.
mystic. Yeah. And like some people think she takes it a bit far, right? With like describing God as mother, right? So she extends this concept of motherhood as this nourishing, nurturing, giving of self wholly, right? To another unconditionally as, right? If that's the quality of motherhood, like is her argument, then offer like all the more, right? God is mother, right? And so I mean, some people, think that's a bit too far, but I do think too, like we want to, she also says God is father.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've thought myself, a lot on the sense in which like mother as nurturing also needs father as challenging, right? So like the mother's impulse, anyway, this is my impulse, right? Especially as like a Chinese mom, it's like eat, right? Like you've got to eat food, like you have to, like I have to feed you, I have to clothe you, I've got to do everything for you, and the father says no, right? Like let him figure it out himself. Like maybe it means that, he's going to be hungry a little bit, but he has to figure out how to eat on his own. And I think that's hard for a mom, right? Like the worst possible thing for me anyway is like to see anyone in my house go hungry, right? So, right, like the mother's body, right, just speaks of this, right? It's like, this is your food and I'm always available to you, right? Like anyway, that's like kind of the attachment parenting model, right? Which I think is very natural and instinctive for women. I mean, there's a limit to it, right? Like, of course, like we want to balance that with like the mother's own like sort of mental health, right?
Sure.
But there is something natural about just giving and giving and giving. But then the father, I think, right, is the one who helps her to say, okay, like sometimes material gift is not all, right? And I think Mary shows this, right? It's not just material gift; it's spiritual gift too. And spiritual gift sometimes means that we have to hold back and we have to discipline, like for the child's good. And so this is a hard teaching, right? Because like the child does come to us so dependent, vulnerable, and needy. And the mother just wants to give everything. But the child is going to change and they grow and they get to a point in which they need to become independent and learn to depend not on mom or dad, but on God. And that means like becoming a person in their own right.
Yeah, and there is that sense that in the ancient tradition, courage is the willingness to suffer, the willingness to fall in battle, the willingness to suffer.
And courage is Andrea, manliness, right?
And courage is also the willingness to let others suffer, right? To let your comrades fall in battle, to let others suffer. And we see, right, Mary in the Catholic tradition, right, revealed not only to be the one who nourished and protected and tried to protect Jesus, except when she lost him, when he was 12, right? But then has to let him suffer on the cross, has to let him suffer in his public ministry. And, she has that willingness to do both. There's a, Jordan Peterson recently was talking about the Pietà, the beautiful image in Rome that Michelangelo did of Mary holding the body of Jesus. And it's interesting, her body is actually like twice the size of his body.
Oh yeah, that's true.
In this beautiful sculpture, so that she can hold
encompassing
his
him.
whole body. But he said in a way that every mother who has a child is bringing in a child into the world.
Yeah. And has to have that courage. Yeah. And we have to have that courage.
And so it is also a great act of courage. And I think it's just hard. I think a lot of people are in a way afraid of suffering themselves and afraid of their loved ones suffering.
That's a great contrast, by the way, from Achilles' mother, right? So Achilles' mother, Thetis, the goddess, like repeatedly asks him not to go into battle because she knows he's going to die, right, at the hands of Paris, right? But of course, he has to do the manly thing and go into battle. But it's just striking. Yeah, I think, you think of Thetis as the goddess mother of Achilles and then Mary, right? Like this contrast, right, in which Mary says yes to everything. And doesn't make it, easier. It doesn't make that's hard.
But that is in some ways, right? I think the vocation of all mothers and fathers at some point is to say, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
To
let
God.
It be,
to God.
To
yeah.
God. Let
yeah,
it be
that's
done
right, yeah.
to me
Yeah.
and to them according to
Yeah.
thy will.
Yeah.
Just maybe a different topic, but related. I think the question of adoption often shows up. I've noticed even in popular culture, almost more of a suspicion of adoption. I think adoption rates have gone down broadly in the U.S. Sometimes there are, even in popular culture, shows or different things, kind of a certain sense of, I don't know, like instead of seeing adoption as something beautiful, we often recognize we're very attentive, I think, to some of the, maybe, the desire, maybe to know biological parents or different things like this. But how does adoption fit in? I mean, it's kind of strange if you're describing motherhood as primarily or as first discovered as a biological reality.
Yeah.
It seems like human beings are kind of weird because throughout history, we've also practiced non-biological motherhood.
Yeah.
And the practice of adoption, right, is a real thing. So
Yeah.
how does that fit into an account of motherhood?
Yeah, there's so much to say about adoption. I mean, I think one thing is to notice how difficult adoption can be. Like we don't want to put on have a rosy picture of this. I mean, it can be very challenging for families to adopt. And yet, I think, especially in light of the theological fact that we are all adopted, right?
Wow.
As God's children, we, can view adoption as actually like offering the paradigm of the real work of a parent, right? Like you didn't get the benefit of having the child get to know your body, right, for the first time. And that's huge advantage, right? Like babies, by the way, like know the scent of their mothers, right? Like they can pick out like through the milk, like because it smells like the amniotic fluid. So, so you're lacking all of those advantages. Not only that, and, people call, psychologists call this the primal wound, right? Like of the child being separated from the mother under whatever circumstances, right, in whatever way, but it's that too is, even if the baby doesn't remember it later on, explicitly there's an implicit wound there, right? So there are all these disadvantages that theologically we would say, okay, like there's sin, right? There just is sin, and yet God adopts us, right? Like as forlorn and sinful and, like sort of miserable as we are.
Yeah, and you mean are you kind of mean like that kind of almost like that state of brokenness and wounded and evil, like not evil insofar as like personal evil that may have contributed, kind of but just the general sense of this kind of way in which we're born into a world that is not yet our home, almost. That's right. And so then how does adoption kind of enter into that brokenness?
I think in so many ways, right? So one very important thing, right, is that I think parents should not think that parenthood just comes naturally. Especially like as the child begins to grow, develop psychologically, spiritually. There's so much, I think, moral formation that should go into parenthood that I think is scandalous, actually, that no one offers this as a matter of course. Like everyone's offered like birthing classes, like even like maybe like to some extent nursing classes, right? Things like this. No one teaches you, right? Like how to actually parent a child and, a very deliberative, like conscious, right? And the stuff that adoptive parents do is just incredible, right? It's like heroism beyond, right?
So
given that suffering in the background.
There's a way so the natural paradigm would be kind of biological motherhood and fatherhood, which then adoptive parents realize and instantiate through their own love and decision.
Right.
But I almost hear you suggesting in a certain sense that the adoptive parent becomes almost something like the normative standard by which we judge the biological parent, because the biological parent almost has to make a decision to kind of adopt their own child.
Right.
Yes, this is a child that that is my physical lineage, but am I going to claim and adopt and love this child?
And I think that's a very important paradigm for us, especially in light of the fact that we cannot assume that our children are just like us, right? Like children are their own people, like as we know, like they may have a completely different temperament. He's going to have, my son is going to have a vocation that I do not know about. It's mysterious to me, right? So I think like biological parents may have a tendency to think that we possess our children, right? It's like, I knew your beginning, right? Like I made you, right? Like this sort of thing. But we don't, right? Like we don't know actually, right? There's a kind of mystery about the way the child comes about. Like the mother doesn't know like when and where exactly, right? Like a child is conceived in her own body, right? So like to preserve a sense of mystery, I think adoptive parents can help us to see how important it is to preserve that mystery about the other person, even if we think, okay, this is my flesh and blood. But no, like you don't know this child, right? And they have a vocation that only God knows because he calls the child, right?
Yeah.
And we are just cooperators, really, right? Like in this like act of bringing about like this new life, which is incredible, right? To have this like completely novel being, right? Suddenly in the world. Like there was a time before when we did not exist. And yet, so like God calls us, and I think adoptive parents can very helpfully remind us, right? Us biological parents of that, the need for this formation, the deliberative act of parenting.
And the reception of the gift and the unknown. You know, and I'm sure you know this, but you know, when Aquinas talks about procreation, he always talks about like one of the, you know, the duties of the natural law and the inclination of the natural law, right? It's towards the procreation and education of children. I think sometimes today we focus on simply, right? We're so worried either avoiding fertility or getting fertility exactly as we want it when we want it.
Right.
That we overlook this whole dimension of lovings, moral formation, spiritual formation, even the formation of like the human formation of how to fail. Largely, that's what
crucial,
human beings are good at. I've discovered as I've gotten older and have older children, the main thing is it's a question of how do we learn to fail without giving up? How do we learn to make mistakes and find our way again? That's really, and I feel like that's what motherhood, but in some ways in modernity, it seems like we have this tendency, we want to get it right and we don't want to make mistakes. We're kind of afraid of making mistakes. And I don't know about you as a mother, but at least for me as a father, fatherhood is largely a way of my discovering my mistakes, but also recognizing that good comes through them. That that by not giving up and giving myself and others, right, the space to make mistakes. And the space to grow is a real part of that vocation. So I like your sense that the fatherhood or the motherhood is not about like saying, oh, this is my project, this is my person that I get to shape. It's more, this is a mystery that I get to receive and offer the best that I have.
We're custodians. So in that sense, we're not that far off from the adoptive parent, I think. I think that's how we should view it, you know?
Wow. There's a beautiful prayer that I was taught. But, you know, Lord, before they were mine, they were yours, and I put them back in your hands.
That's beautiful.
And maybe there is something that the biological parent has a temptation to see their children as their own possessions. And of course, but I think that's a really powerful theme. You know, you did have the chance to teach this class to students at Ave Maria University. What were some of the things that maybe you remember from teaching that class? What were either questions that students have, or maybe things that students have shared with you that they like took from the class?
I think our students are very serious about marriage, and they're very serious about becoming parents, and they understand that, you know, marriage has this important, implication. I mean, it's essential to marriage that we want children, you know, and, they had all, you know, it was a very, very lively class. There were lots of debates in the class about, you know, what constitutes grave reason for practicing NFP, right, for postponing the birth of a child. There were debates about how work-life balance. I mean, this question about, sort of, can you be a professional woman outside of the home and also be a mother? What does that look like?
Sure.
There were also lots of questions about the relationships between men and women. You know, what is the female nature compared with the man's? And we read a lot of Edith Stein, and some people hated her, and some people loved her. You know, so I mean, it was a very, very lively class. And there was just all manner of, you know, debate, you know, that you can imagine about every topic. And I think that's good, right? Like, I mean, you know, I certainly have my own views about motherhood, but I'm also a philosopher, and I recognize that, you know, we want to keep open some of these questions and have objections, right? And have people, you know, offer like disagreeing viewpoints sometimes, and that actually helps us, right? It furthers the discussion. So I don't teach the course as if it's everything's settled, certainly. But I think that I think the class was very fruitful for myself as well as all of my
Good
students.
Pun intended. There. Question for you. Now, the course was Philosophy of Motherhood, and you're a philosopher. What is it? What about what's the importance of the theology of motherhood, and what is it specifically maybe that you've learned or you think is important to know? That in a way we know better in a way because God has revealed it to us.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I think the course, that we offered was quite theological, actually. I think it was cross-listed with theology, actually, for at least one person. But I don't, it doesn't strike me as possible really to fully understand the significance of motherhood from merely the natural or biological point of view, as fascinating as that account is. And I think the science of motherhood is really fascinating.
Yeah.
It's incredible, by the way, that, we know so much about the fetus in the womb, and people think it's amazing that babies can hear right at 21 weeks or whatever, the heartbeat. But none of that seems to matter, right? When you don't want the baby, right? When you don't want the child, then forget about all of that science, right? So I think it's very worth studying the embryology, right? The science of the fetus, and the hidden life, right, of the baby, but as well as the life of maternity, right? How fascinating it is to be a mother. But at the end of the day, I think that temptation to say, I made this baby remains, right? And to say, this child is mine, I can, do with them what I want, right? And, or give them as much autonomy as I want or whatever, right? It just seems really arbitrary, right? Based on that, unless we see motherhood as itself a vocation that begets another vocation. So what I mean by that is, right, it's not just that, nature, it's like it just happened, right? We had a baby, right? There are no accidents, right? Within theology, Boethius says, nothing is random, right? There is no haphazard, right? God, right, he sees all, right? And he knew us before we even existed in some sense, right? So I think from that point of view, a mother and a father cannot possibly see things just from the natural point of view, right? It's not up to us to dictate the fates of our children, nor our own fates for that matter. And, we have to see ourselves as merely a character within this great theater that God has arranged, right? There's this great, the great play, right, of life, right? That God is the composer of, and we're just a character within it, sort of. Yes, we're given responsibility for a child, and it's a huge honor. It just feels like a huge honor, and to be the custodian and to sort of help the child see his vocation. And so I think to see it that way, I just think it falls really short. If we don't have that supernatural perspective, because what are we then as parents? We're no better really than the cow or the horse or the what have you, right? The animal mothers that anyone can be a mother. Right, any animal can become a mother,
absolutely.
but only human beings can try to attain the supernatural vision that Mary had when she had Jesus. Wow. Right, there's something really powerful for me anyway. When we couldn't have children, we just never, nothing happened. Then out of the blue, someday, right, one day, Paul Thomas was conceived. And of course, my temptation was, I'm scared to death that I'm going to lose this baby, right?
Sure.
I've never been pregnant before, and then after he's born, I'm scared to death that he's gonna die, right? So this is the mother's worst fear, as we've talked about, right? That the child should die, and yet it's only a supernatural vision that says, but that may be the child's vocation, right? It may be that God is calling your child to him, right? And that's. That just changes everything. It's not okay, the natural remains. No, the natural, I think, right? There's no tragedy in that. If we see things with the eyes of Mary, right? This is the great triumph of Christ on the cross, right? Her own son on the cross. Wow. So anyway,
that's really beautiful. And I think discovering, not only that God is the creator and that he gives order and meaning to the universe, but he's a merciful, loving father, right? Who will mercifully, if we are willing, right, to turn to him, will shower us with his mercy, will welcome us home. And the beauty in some ways, right, with our children is that, if they struggle that they can also turn back, or even if they depart from this life, if they die, that they can turn back to God's loving arms. So no, that's really a beautiful, just a beautiful image of how, right, the faith helps us discover our own vocations. I wanted to close with three kind of brief questions. You can give quick answers if you'd like. But so what's a book you're reading?
Well, I've got the Summa Theologia right now in my backpack.
That's awesome.
I'm reading. I actually picked up. I've started reading Saint Therese of Lisieux again, right? Her autobiography, because it's come up in conversation many times over the past few weeks for me. Sorry, this is a longer answer, but
no, it's fine.
Just quickly. I mean, I was at a conference on Mother Teresa. It was this inaugural conference of the St. Mother Teresa Institute, and our old friend Jim Toohey was there. And so, I think what I learned from that conference too is how much the Little Flower influenced Mother Teresa's sense of her being a mother. And so that really struck me, and I said, okay, I need to reread this.
Wow.
But yeah, I was very struck by the fact that for Mother Teresa, the greatest honorific was being called mother.
Yeah.
Like even when she was elevated, to the highest possible position, like she said, no, call me mother.
I think it was Pope Francis in his canonization homily for Mother Teresa, who actually said, we're going to continue to call her Mother Teresa because she is a mother. Yeah. All of ours. So I think that's beautiful. Second question is, what's a daily habit or practice that you do to find meaning and purpose in your life?
That's a good. So I think one habit that I really try to instill is to get out of bed and instead of checking my phone,
That's great.
I try to get down on the ground and I say to God, like, this day is yours and everything in it. So I mean, it's hard for us to practice detachment, right? But like this little spiritual practice like reminds me, like, this day does not belong to me. I'm not going to be completely in control of it, but I'm going to do as much as I can to offer to God. So that's just like one little.
That's really wonderful. And final question, right? This show's about theology. So one of the things we try to think about is that ideas about God matter. And if we don't have good ideas about God, we often have bad ideas about God. So maybe, what's one bad idea or kind of false belief you had about God that maybe, hurt you? And what's the truth you discovered?
Wow, that's I can't possibly give a short answer to that, but I think I remember a point. So I'm a convert, and I was raised by awesome parents, and by awesome I mean like really ambitious, happiness will be found in achievement too. And this is me. Like it also is me. Like I don't have a problem with saying like we should be ambitious people, right? But it also means that I think I'm speaking to what you were just saying about like making mistakes. Like it's hard to make mistakes under like a very like high ambition, achievement oriented culture. And I remember the parable of the prodigal son being very, very helpful to me because as you're saying, like God is He's not just perfect in his pure actuality and, and okay, we're supposed to be like God in that respect, but he's also a merciful, loving father. He's a father who like waits by the road, like day after day, like looking out for you, come rain or shine, right? He's like watching, like hoping that we'll like come to him. And this was very helpful for me as a convert, right? From, I mean, I still retain, like, I still think, people should be ambitious and like you should do as well as you possibly can, like anything that you set your mind to. But on the other hand, failure and imperfection and right the weakness of the human heart, right, is actually necessary for us to see who we are and to see the truth and to attain that excellence too. Like we can't be excellent without sometimes being not excellent, right? So, and I've seen this too with like being a mom, right? Like you have to let the child fall a few.
Thank you so much for joining us for this podcast. If you like this episode, please rate and review it on your favorite podcast app to help others find the show. And if you want to take the next step, please consider joining our Annunciation Circle so we can continue to bring you more free content. We'll see you next time on the Catholic Theology Show.